Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another exciting virtual tour. I'm your host, Chris, with Pretty Great Tours, and it looks like we're not streaming live on Facebook yet, so let me see if I can get that going right now. I'm doing, I don't know what it is about not wanting to go up on Facebook yet, so let's see. I'll get this all here. Check right now. And I'm hoping it works tonight. Let's see how it goes. Yes, we're live on every platform. Just now, it's absolutely live. We don't have technical difficulties on the days when it's not. So welcome. I'm really very excited tonight to share this tour with you. Fort Steilacoom is, for me, one of the most exciting places in Washington state. I think it is one of the most pivotal locations in Washington's history. And it is a location where we have determined our fate as a state and as a people from the very beginning. So many moments of Washington's existence have been weighed as part of a moral judgment out here. And tonight, we're going to walk you through that. And what's so cool about historic Fort Steilacoom is that it has 4 of its original buildings from 1857 still on the site there. So if you're ready, let me know. Guys, it's good to see you too. I'm glad you're all here. If you have questions along the way, please let me know. I will do my best to answer them, and let's kick this beauty off, shall we? So if you are just learning about this for the very first time, let me first start by saying that not only myself, but everybody at the Fort Steilacoom site and museum would like to acknowledge that all of the site and all of this history takes place on the land of the Coast Salish peoples who have occupied this area since time immemorial. And the story of the indigenous population factors really heavily into the Fort Steilacoom narrative specifically, but also obviously Washington's. And when you visit this, which I hope that you will, bear in mind it's not just a historic site, but it is also a functional museum. And they have tried to set up each of these buildings to be an interpretive center so that you can go and actually dive in yourself to the background of this place. It is, as the plaque acknowledging it states, first established in 1849 and then left in 1868. And that doesn't even begin to cover the history of this site. It has been an occupied area for far back as anybody can remember, but it has also been a farm. It has been part of a mental hospital. It has been a park, this whole region. And the site that we're really specifically looking at tonight is just the Fort Steilacoom buildings. And there's a lot of confusion often because Fort Steilacoom can often get misinterpreted as Steilacoom, the town, or Fort Steilacoom Park, which is a separate entity across the street, or Western State Hospital, which does technically, encompass the grounds of the Fort Steilacoom Museum and military site. So there's a lot that we're going to untaffy tonight, but I promise we will do it all, and hopefully we'll do it with flair. So first, let me get you guys acquainted with what we're talking about. Historic Fort Steilacoom is located immediately east of Western State Hospital, and it is significantly more east than the town site of Steilacoom, and it is just across Steilacoom Boulevard from Fort Steilacoom Park. And when you're looking at the site that we're talking about tonight, these are the 4 original buildings constructed in 1857. But when you're looking around, there is history beyond even that. The Gary oaks that stud this campus are, for me, one of the most significant parts of the whole place. The Gary oak is not only a tree that lives for a really significant period of time, but it is endemic to this area. The Pacific Northwest, specifically the Pacific coast of North America, is the only place where these Gary oaks grow naturally. And the ones that occupy the site today are either originals or descendants of the originals, from acorn to mighty oak, of the Gary oaks that once witnessed so much of this history's region. And I love when trees stick around for a long time. Anytime there's a tree that's been a witness to history and literally drank it up through its roots, I get real excited about that. So fair warning tonight, I'm into trees. Now, this is like I said, the traditional area of the Coast Salish peoples. The Steilacoom tribe is a very prominent example of those who have actively lived and worked in this area, who have taken stewardship of this land. And that's one of the things that made the Fort Steilacoom site so appealing, is that it had been diligently taken care of by the Steilacoom tribe. And so when settlers out of Europe were arriving to this area, it became one of the few locations where they thought that farming could take place really nicely. Now, inside the Fort Steilacoom Museum itself, they have this incredible diorama. We're learning all my passions tonight, not just trees, but also dioramas, that was created by a volunteer there, that shows what the original site would have looked like. And one of the things you'll notice straight away is that it is, in the diorama, significantly larger than what you see today. And I'll cover why that's happened, but it has transformed from farm to military fort to mental hospital to city park over these years, and been parceled off into different sections and sent away. But as a fort, it was really large. And so you can see out there in the middle, the parade grounds out here, and then a lot of the buildings that used to be alongside the parade grounds and the drill grounds out there. And these are the four that still exist. So you've got the chaplain's hall, you've got one of the soldiers' quarters, you've got the commanding officers' quarters here, and then you've got another officers' quarters right down here at the end. And again, those have survived for years, which is mind-blowing to say the least. Hopefully tonight, we're going to have members of the Fort Steilacoom Museum jump on the chat. So if you have detailed questions that you would like answers to, something that goes beyond the breadth and depth of my personal knowledge, I'm sure they'll be happy to answer it. But if you're tuning into this after the fact, you'll just have to go through the comments and hope that somebody asks your question. When you're looking at those buildings, here's the exterior of them. This is the chaplain's house and chapel as it looks today. This is officers' quarters. This is the commanding officers' quarters. And then down at the end there is, again, another officers' quarters building. And while those are original structures, they have been done up differently so that you can see different, not different periods of time, but different ways that it could be done. And in a moment, I'm going to take you actually through each of these buildings so that you can see what it looks like now. And one of the things I want to prep you for is that each one has been done differently. The commanding officer's quarters, for example, contains the historic research library, which has all the texts, documents, and books that go along with the museum. It also has a large room that they use for their candlelight tours. And let me stop you right there. If you have not yet done one of their Christmas tours, where it's all done up with the candlelight and they have the reenactors come in, chef's kiss perfection. But that one is done up so that you can see different elements of it. The upstairs is its whole separate thing as well. The very far end, the officers' quarters that is closest, let me see if I can bring it up here for you guys on the diorama. The officers' quarters that is closest to Western State Hospital, located right here, is the one that is left most historically accurate to what it would have looked like in 1857. And then the chaplain's hall is the one that actually has the museum, like front office, gift shop, the diorama, all that inside. So it goes from more interpretive to more immersive, is how I've just now coined that phrase. So let's take a look inside. If you guys have questions along the way, let me know, but let's see if I can prep this up for you guys.
For people to forget about Fort Steilacoom. Even though it was established in 1849 and is the oldest U.S. Army post in the Puget Sound region, it only has the 4 original buildings remaining, and they are on the site of Western State Hospital, so it's easy to get lost. If you're new here, the natural starting point is the old chaplain's house, one of the original 1857 buildings. Now, used as the Welcome Center today, this has a gift shop inside, as well as several pieces of it that offer a look at what life was like when this was Fort Steilacoom. You can see the original construction of the walls, which is fascinating because they used timber from the site to construct these buildings. It only took them about a year to get the permanent structures erected, and they used local timber. Having been constructed predominantly in 1857, it is an absolute wonder that these buildings are still around today. And the chaplain's house, in particular, offers an interesting look. Now, the upstairs has been rearranged so that it can give a few different glimpses, like a guard's house, a blacksmith's working station, and a few other moments in time. None of these would have actually been located inside this building, but they utilized the space on the second floor to provide an opportunity for interpretive learning. For me, the guardhouse is one of the most fascinating elements here, and I'm glad that they have representation for it, because it was a pivotal part of this superstructure, and the original building is no longer here. The guardhouse was not only used for local law enforcement and insubordinate soldiers, but also to house Chief Leschi. When you look out the windows of this building today, you get a glimpse at something that's been here forever. The Garry Oaks, which are a pivotal part of this landscape. Garry Oaks are endemic to the Pacific Northwest and are a startling reminder of how much this landscape is seen. Just down the street is one of the 4 original structures. This is quarters number 1, and it might be one of my favorites. It's at the far end of the lineup of houses here, and it's the one that has been set up to showcase what life would have been like in 1857. So the entirety of this home is designed to make you feel like whatever officer was living there had just walked out. From the newspaper that's on the desk, to the maps, the charts, the paperwork, all of this is supposed to look like a slice of time. While a lot of the other buildings have had different uses interjected throughout the different rooms, this one is the most cohesive in what it's supposed to look like. Even through the kitchen here, which really tries to rely on only what you would have seen in 1857, with some exceptions. But the bathtub, that is very much period appropriate.
It's an interesting way to take a bath. I don't know that I'd recommend it.
Now, because Fort Steilacoom is an interpretive center and history museum, they use the historical accuracy of this particular home to really highlight their candlelight tours that they do around Christmas time. It gives you the best glimpse at what life was like at that time and really lets you sink into the moment, I think. When you look around, the plaster, the walls, these are, as much as possible, the original ones from the 1850s. Now, the furniture and rugs, those have been donated over time. You have to bear in mind, of course, that as old as these buildings are, they haven't been used continuously as military outposts. By the 1860s, the U.S. military had abandoned these structures and turned them over to the Washington State Hospital. When you go upstairs, there's even more to take in here. And one of the fascinating aspects of this place for me are the bedrooms. This is really representative of what an officer's quarters would have looked like as they would have had their family with them out here. So you get to see a little bit less of the military edge and a little bit more of the homey feel. One of the things that's really interesting, though, are these beds. They are supported by ropes with whatever type of mattress on top, feathers, straw, whatever would have been available at the time. Fun story, these rope beds are actually where the phrase sleep tight comes from, because you want to make sure that those are nice and tight so you don't just fall through in the middle of the night. They are sufficient. I'm not into it, though.
Overall, it's not bad. I'm not gonna get rid of my mattress, though.
Just across the hall on the second story of quarters 1, they've set it up to reflect more of a child's room or a nursery, to show you a little bit about what that would have looked like at the time. One of the coolest features for me is actually this old school water bottle. Exactly what it sounds like. You would fill this up with hot water, and then it could be kept with you in the bed at night to help keep you warm. Because again, those ropes aren't going to be doing the most for insulation. Another particularly interesting feature of this room is the old hidey hole. This is, to the best of our knowledge, original to the 1850s structure, and we are not sure what was hiding down here, but you can use your imagination. Whatever a military officer in the 1860s would have wanted to hide, it could have easily been tucked in down here. Just a couple doors down is the commanding officer's quarters, and this is one of the original 4 buildings as well, and would have been the one to house Colonel Silas Casey while he was in command of the fort. This one is also set up to be more representative of a variety of different things, not just to look historically accurate, but also very popular during the candlelight tours. What I like about this one is that you get an exposed angle at the wood used, and you can actually see where they would take one whole board and then split it several times to create that Latin plath wall structure that the forts had. The other thing you'll see is that there was really no insulation whatsoever. But this is one of the historic structures that for the last 100+ years has been used both by the U.S. military and then by Western State Hospital. And you see some indications of that inside, like the ceiling here. Back in the late 1800s, when the doctors for the mental institution were living in these as quarters, they had these stenciled onto the ceiling to create a little more color and pop than the military installation would have had. And there are small sections where you still get to see that original paint job on the ceiling, though not on the walls as far as I'm aware. It's a beautiful restoration that they've got up there, and you get to see just how much color was in there. Speaking of which, you can see the library that's housed inside this building. This is a historic research library that's part of the Fort Steilacoom Museum and houses several original works as well as the vast majority of literature associated with that time period and can be used by people who would like to do some research in the area. Inside the historic library, you can also see some artifacts, including a lot of these traditional baskets that would have been from the Coast Salish people. Not necessarily in the 1850s, but certainly older examples of those. Now in the main hall, you can actually swing over and then head into this large room. This room is used for the majority of meetings on the Fort Steilacoom facility, but it used to be separated. On the far end is a troop entrance, and the troops would come in, probably from the drilling ground, proceed through, and then eventually arrive for orders or whatever they needed to inside this building. And you can see the original brick inside. Upstairs, it has now been set up for a little bit more interpretation. So you'll see some of the museum cases here, and then out here, past the drill ground, which again, remember, this was a massive, wide open space where they would do military drills. And you can still see some of those when they do reenactments out in this area here. But the upstairs has been set up so that you can actually see what life would have looked like inside the facilities. This particular room inside the commanding officer's quarters has been set up to represent a traditional sergeant's quarters. You get to see a lot of the literature, songs, newspapers, and things that would have been popular at the time, as well as traditional games, and even a trunk in the corner over here that represents a lot of the paraphernalia that a soldier at that time, particularly a sergeant, would have had on them. Standard U.S. military blanket, and then insignia, pipes, buttons, polish, paste, everything that you would need to have in your kit. And then right next door, you get a glimpse into a soldier's life with this very detailed rundown of what a soldier's day looked like. Up bright and early at 5 a.m. and then out, cleaning, training, living their lives. These quarters represent what life for the non-officer soldiers would have looked like. And what I think is interesting about these bunks is that you see on each level there's 2 of them, and they slept head to foot. This was done so that you could keep track of your bunkmate, keep an eye on their health, as well as make sure you didn't have any deserters in the middle of the night. This room also has a nice showcase of games and diversions that the soldiers would have had available to them at that time, as well as the shower here. Well, for whatever you needed the water. And then right down the hall is a good showcase on how laundry was done at the time. And laundry was a huge operation done by women in the area to keep this fort running. Now, just next door, this quarter has been set up to showcase what the shop would have looked like. This isn't the actual shop building, but it shows you today what they would have had available to them and sold to not just soldiers, but also pioneers in the area. It's got a fascinating selection of small books and literature, ephemera, if you will, of what was available then, as well as all the dried goods that you could have found inside the shop in 1857. Then across the hall, you'll get a really good look at a soldier's office. This one in particular for an officer, and shows the saddle made ready over here, as well as their desk that they would need to go through the daily activities of a soldier enlisted in this area. Not only letters, documentation, maps, everything that you would need to prepare yourself, and then quite a lot of journals. And we actually know a significant amount about Fort Steilacoom because of the detailed journals kept by military men there. And not just journals, a lot of these guys were prolific writers, like Lieutenant August Kautz, who wrote quite a bit in the local newspaper to make his opinions on different social matters abundantly known. So you can go back through and see a lot of those real detailed accounts of daily life there, and it's done a lot to inform the museum. Now, upstairs is an interesting look at sort of the medical life at that time. This has been set up as if it were the hospital ward for the fort down here in Steilacoom, and you get to see kind of a moment in time here of what things would have looked like for these soldiers who had to deal with a whole variety of diseases and issues, especially trying to combat the cold of winter in the Pacific Northwest in the 1850s. And you've seen the insulation on these places. It's not amazing. Most of these guys are going to recover, but, not all of them. Some of them are going to stay here in the museum for a long time, like our buddy here. But at least he never left his post. We're not the East Coast, and a lot of people think that there's not a ton of military history here, but not just this fort, but Washington State in general has had a significant number of notable members of the U.S. military here. So that is a look inside the fort itself. And I think it's awesome that you get the opportunity to really showcase that space, right? We had a question here. When do the Christmas tours start? That's a great question. And Historic Fort Steilacoom did us the courtesy of answering right here, Saturday, December 9th. You can watch their Facebook information to see when those tickets go on sale and get everything you need taken care of there. And if you're not currently following their Facebook page, you probably should be. But how do we get here? How do we get to a military fort established out here in the Pacific Northwest? I'm glad you asked, everyone. Here we go. So after the time of the Steilacoom tribe living very prominently in the area, the first European settler that we really come out here and make a honest go of it, which is ironic considering who he was, is this boy right here, Joseph Heath. And here's the deal about Joseph Heath. In my opinion, he's a problematic dude. He is the oldest of an English gentry family, and he bankrupts all of them by gambling away the family fortune. And he's like, oh no, what should I do with my life? And his brother, who's working on a ship that runs now to the Pacific Northwest for the Hudson Bay Company, is like, listen, bro, you could probably come out to this new territory of the crown and make a lot of money. Read just enough to get us out of the problems that you put us in. And so Heath agrees to it. And the arrangement that he strikes with the company is that 50% of his earnings will go to paying off the debts that he has accrued for his family. And the other 50% will go to the company itself, right? So it's like tense for him, but he doesn't have a lot of options. And so he pioneers his way out here to the Pacific Northwest and lives very much in isolation. The only other European establishment out here at the time would have been Fort Nisqually down in the Nisqually area. And Heath, by the skin of his teeth, makes it. Here's a artist's rendering of the Joseph Heath farm. And he strikes up early diplomatic relations with the local tribal members, and it's a tense existence where he is not a great, ambassador for the region. Nobody's really excited to have him there, including his own family, but he makes a go of it and eventually starts farming to such a capacity that he can provide for the area. But the Canadian trappers keep coming in and eating him out of house and home. And he finally builds things up. During an outbreak of the measles, he comes in and abandons his fear of the local tribe, brings some cows in. And during the measles epidemic, the women of the tribe weren't producing enough milk to feed the babies. And Heath, who has traditionally been super scared of interacting with anyone indigenous, comes into town. He rigs up horn bottles, fills them with cow's milk, and helps take care of this village. And things are starting to look good for him right when, what do you know, Washington territory now looks like it's going to be ceded over to U.S. command. And as this is no longer going to be Great Britain, it's now U.S. military area, Heath is devastated. He's like, what am I even going to do? But turns out, not only do the Americans eat as much as the Canadians, they have to pay, unlike soldiers of the crown. And so he looks like he's actually going to make it. He can have a farm. He has good relationships with his neighbors. He is getting to the point where he can actually make a community here. And one of the guys who is really influential in brokering these relationships between Heath and the rest of the community is our boy, Dr. William Ptolemy. And you probably, if you've been in the region at all, know about this guy. He was the doctor down at Fort Nisqually, and his house is still at Fort Nisqually. If you're not aware, Fort Nisqually still exists. A couple of the buildings are original. A lot of it is done historically accurately, but made recently. And in the 1930s, as part of the WPA, getting everybody back to work, giving them random jobs, the U.S. had this group of dudes go down, pick up Fort Nisqually's original buildings and bring them to Point Defiance Park, where they are established as a living history museum today. And inside the living history museum / park of Fort Nisqually, Dr. Ptolemy's house still exists. You can go visit it. And Ptolemy is talking about how things are looking up for Joseph Heath. Everything's going to go great. And then, what do you know? We've got our last journal entry from our boy here, where in February of 1849, he writes, "Dick shut up the pigs and salted them, unable to do anything myself, voice gone and myself very weak." And running a temperature of 41 degrees Celsius, Joseph passes away that night. And with him goes all of the hard work. The farm now lays practically abandoned. Hudson Bay Company, with no real interest in the area now that it's turning over to the U.S., kind of just walks away from the whole thing. But what do you know? This is now a perfect opportunity for our new boys in blue to show up. So with a great deal of chaos erupting in the region, specifically the death of an American, Leander Wallace, during an attack on Fort Nisqually in 1849, the U.S. government decides that they want to create an official military presence in this area. And so in August of 1849, remember, Joseph Heath dies in February. By August, Captain Bennett Hill, his artillery company, arrives with 23 men and a bugler, not this guy specifically, but a bugler, and they began the establishment of Fort Steilacoom, the first official U.S. military post here in what is now Washington State. And they arrive out here to essentially provide military presence and backing, because they believe, rightfully so, that there's about to be a great deal of trauma and conflict erupting between the indigenous peoples and the U.S. government, as well as creating infrastructure and establishment in the area so that it becomes more likely that U.S. settlers will go out as part of the Land Donation Claim Act and start creating their presence there. So now they can manifest their destiny across the country. And so our boy, Captain Hill, comes out, brings his company, and when they arrive, they're like, oh, shoot, you know what's perfect? This farm. all of the Joseph Heath buildings were just laying there, and they strike up an arrangement with the British Crown and start to occupy them. So the first Fort Steilacoom was actually the log buildings that Joseph Heath had created as part of his farm. And the barracks was these farm buildings. And this is where the soldiers started to occupy. None of those exists today. But you see the origin story of this area start to explode. By 1855, the Medicine Creek Treaty and the Puget Sound Treaty Wars are becoming the dominating event of this area here. And as the U.S. military starts to occupy this area and enforce treaties on the region, Fort Steilacoom becomes one of the most important, if not the most important, in my personal opinion, areas there, because they are providing the military, infrastructure and support. They're also acting as a refuge. As soon as the Puget Sound Treaty Wars began to erupt with all this violence, all the homesteaders that were in the region just fled in the night through the woods, leaving children and spouses behind, and arrived in various states of panic to Fort Steilacoom, which, don't think of it like Fort Nisqually. This wasn't ever a military structure that had a wall. They had like an earthworks that they erected around key parts of it, but not even the entirety of it. This was more of a supply station, a depot, and something to provide housing for the people that were occupying that area. And so as all these people are coming out here, Ezra Meeker has a quote, which I would like to read for you, where he describes the influx of settlers arriving in a panic there as, quote, a sorry mess of women and children crying, some brutes of men cursing and swearing, oxen and cows bellowing, sheep bleating, dogs howling, children lost from their parents, wives from husbands, no order. In a word, the utmost disorder. And to combat this, General John Wool dispatched the first regular army reinforcements to Fort Steilacoom in November 1855. And deployed one company of soldiers from the 3rd Artillery Regiment, commanded by Captain Erasmus Darwin, Keyes, and then were shortly followed, not long after that, by Commander Lieutenant Colonel Silas Casey of the 9th Infantry. And here's Colonel Silas Casey right here. And as they start to establish order, they've got blacksmiths, they've got carpenters, they're creating this. They need someone to really bring in some semblance of just like law and order to this whole situation that is the fort. And this is where my boy comes in, Lieutenant August Kautz. And if you get anything from tonight, it's that I am a big fanboy for Lieutenant Kautz. I think he is one of the most instrumental figures in the area and certainly a paragon of human morality, which I don't say about anyone. But as the artillery and the infantry troops start to arrive, Lieutenant Kautz is the guy who is tasked with turning this from a sorry mess of disorder into a genuine military fort. And in February 1856, to confront the indigenous warriors in the area along Notchie's Pass Road, in conjunction with soldiers from Washington Territorial Volunteers and indigenous allies, the American forces engaged in aggressive patrolling and occupation of key trails and needed more and more to draw from. So by 1857, our boy August Kautz comes out and creates the fort as we know it. And he's in constant turmoil the whole time from everything I've ever read about him. His commanding officer is giving him trouble. The people that he's in command of are difficult to work with. He's in rough conditions. It's out here. He's got a year in the wild Pacific Northwest to turn this whole operation around, and he does it. And I think a testament to the success of him is that there are the 4 original buildings still down there at Fort Steilacoom today. But guess what? They're not the only one. Were constructed in 1857. And we just talk about the 4 that are still at the site, but there's actually a 5th building constructed in 1857 that was removed from the site in 1864. and it still exists today. The Catholic church that was built on site has been moved to downtown Steilacoom, where it still operates as a church today, known as Immaculate Conception. So Couts creates this massive legacy in the area, and to have those 5 buildings still around is remarkable. And I think you saw it in the earlier portion there. You can see that it's the same timber, right? I love this one in particular. This is the fireplace. It's just above the fireplace in the commanding officer's quarters. And you can see where they were milling down the timber and then splitting it. And you can see the irregular splits there so that you know that it was just one large piece of timber that they used for their Latin plath construction around there. As Washington Territory is becoming an occupied area, there is obviously a huge amount of conflict that is happening. But with the Medicine Creek Treaty, there is the chapter that begins of a new Washington. The military conflict subsides, and now we have to try and figure out how to live with each other. Not necessarily successfully, but Fort Steilacoom becomes an incredibly pivotal point in that whole story as well. Not just because they are the military presence in Washington Territory, but the people that are there are the key players in how this moves forward. And a great example of that is that at the conclusion of this whole thing, you've got major players on the board now, and Colonel Silas Casey is one of them. Lieutenant August Couts is one of them. And then, of course, Territorial Governor Isaac Stevens, who is, without any question in my mind, one of the most divisive figures historically in Washington's narrative. There are people who love him, and there are people who hate him, but there's so very few people that have any middle ground on him. Like, he is polarizing to the max. I'm going to do my best to be as balanced as possible on this, but here's the thing that Chief Joseph said. Governor Isaac Stevens of Washington Territory said there were a great many white people in our country, and many more would come, that he wanted the land marked out so that the Indians and the white men could be separated. And one of the ways that he enforces this is through Chief Leschi. So Leschi was one of the commanders in this military conflict between the United States and the indigenous peoples living here. And he is accused by Governor Stevens he's accused of killing Colonel A. Moses, who is an enemy combatant, during this war. And one of the things that is so divisive about this is that Stevens is like, I would like to see Leschi prosecuted for the murder of Moses. And the officers at Fort Steilacoom refuse to even hear this out, because they're like, that can't be. He can't have murdered someone. It was wartime. If anything, this would be an act of war. And the first thing that kind of happens is that there is a trial for Leschi against most of the people at the fort's firm disagreement on this. He is acquitted. Lieutenant August Couts is a battlefield forensic investigator who is dispatched out there, establishes that Leschi wasn't even there during that conflict. So even, the fact that it wasn't murder aside, he wasn't even there to have been a part of the combat killing of this soldier Moses. And so Stevens refuses to let that stand. So he decides to create his own court. He gets a judge that he appoints. He brings in his own guys to be part of the jury. What do you know? When it's completely unbalanced, they determine that Leschi is guilty of murder. And then he is executed by hanging in 1858. And today there is, let's see if I can bring it up for you guys here. There's a monument where, in the approximate location, I'll share an article with you guys here in a moment, where the actual hanging they think took place. But the execution of Leschi creates a tremendous amount of turmoil in the area. And later this is where the monument is. Later, Leshai is exhumed and then brought to the Puyallup Tribal Cemetery. Significantly later, the U.S. government passes a resolution acquitting him of this entire thing, clearing his name entirely. But as it's playing out in the moment, you see these players fighting for, in my opinion, the morality of Washington, where Stevens is trying to control the area as much as possible. And for him, the extermination of anyone indigenous is paramount. And going so far as to try Leshai for murder is a good example of that. Whereas you have people like Lieutenant Kautz, who not only present convincing evidence at the trial that Leshai was innocent of the charges altogether, and then went on to say that they couldn't possibly be murder because they were committed during war, if they even had been. But Dr. Tolmie is another really good example of someone who is fighting against this. And Tolmie and Kautz are writing articles and putting them out in the territorial paper, really advocating for this newly minted post to be taking a different tact on this. Stevens ends up winning out and then goes to take it even farther, where Leshai's brother, Quaymuth, had gone in November of 1856, I believe, and then went to Olympia to surrender to Stevens and see if he could help broker some peace in this situation. Quaymuth is there under the guardianship of Governor Isaac Stevens. Stevens locks him up in the office at night, and then Quaymuth gets stabbed to death in the middle of the night. And the official account is that somebody broke in through the back window and then killed Quaymuth, executed him inside the governor's mansion there. But there is a tremendous amount of suspicion that obviously Stevens killed him himself. This is the battle, right, that is seen played out at Fort Steilacoom between men like August Kautz, whose primary objective is to create housing and water and order and discipline and a military post, and then to find a way to exist here after the treaty wars, and guys like Stevens, who would like to just continue scorching the earth as much as possible. And is there a better example of these two men than their death? I don't know. First of all, here's the marker for Leshai in the Puyallup Tribal Cemetery. But when you look at these two guys, they both end up as generals. Major General Isaac Stevens dies in battle during the Civil War, where his flag bearer gets shot. So he runs out, grabs the flag, and leads the charge out into combat. And his son, who's in combat with him, gets shot and cries out to his dad, "Father, I need help." And he essentially says, I'm paraphrasing here, "Boy, you're on your own. I got stuff to do." Has one of his soldiers go look after him and then charges headlong, carrying the flag valiantly into battle, and gets shot in the head, spins around wrapped up in the flag. Meanwhile, Brigadier General August Kautz also serves in the Civil War, has several commanding victories, comes back home, and then retires in Seattle, where he's married to Kitty, who happens to be the daughter of Quaymuth. Absolutely divergent branches of U.S. military history in the Washington Territory, but I think they both reflect the struggle that plays out at Fort Steilacoom. This patch of land, from the moment Joseph Heath shows up, is determining the traditions and the customs and the way that we, as the new people in this territory, treat the people that have already been here. And it goes beyond just, American and European settlers and the indigenous. You see it reflected in the next chapter of this site as well, because once the Civil War empties this fort out, all of the guys who are worth anything at all leave, and they go serve for the North and the South, and then don't come back. And the people that were stationed there then were garbage, right? Like, I don't want to be rude to anyone, but they were terrible. And there was a distinguishable difference between the professional soldiers that were there pre-Civil War and the sort of like whoever we could find to occupy that space after. And so by the 1860s, the fort is determined to be no longer viable and abandoned. And who do they sell it to but the Washington State Hospital for the Insane, who was looking for a new place to house their patients. And so by the 1850s, the territory of Washington was feeling some tension and growing beyond the establishments that they had created. So they needed a new place to send their patients who were dealing with mental illness. And the 640-acre farm and fort out there was suddenly perfect. So in 1871, the territorial officials decide, hey, let's turn this into a mental hospital. And that's what they do. And so it goes from, Steilacoom tribal territory to Joseph Heath's farm to first military fort in Washington State to now our first official funded and bankrolled mental institution. Now, there had been a place called Monticello, which was sort of ramshackled down kind of by like where Kalama is today, sort of out there on the Columbia. But we see this transition now from military fort in the 1850s and 60s to now creating it into what the adjacent property is today with Western State Hospital. But when you're inside the buildings now, the 4 original ones, you got to bear in mind they are a separate entity. So this is a property that is in flux. It is somewhere between Lakewood Parks and Rec, Western State Hospital. They have a foot in the federal camp. They have a foot in the state camp. They're obviously hyper-regional and local, but they kind of exist in this nebulous cloud in between. And so often people forget that they are even there at all because the stigma of the mental institution being right next door, the mental hospital being right there, and it's like the parking lot of Western State that is the Fort Steilacoom site right now, makes it difficult for people to know that it's there or choose to go out there. And that's why events like, this is going to be a flash forward, this room being used for their Christmas time tours is so great because it gives people the opportunity to go in and see the exhibits where it talks about the different munitions that were being used at that time, or to see artifacts like this is one of my favorites. This is a billiards table that was on this post back in the 1850s. They've got a little tab on it here. And it was just so big that it didn't make sense to move it out. The museum has now gone in, and aside from preserving those original artifacts, they've also gone through and tried to recreate as accurate as possible vintage items that would have been located inside. So like the works of John Irving here. And then where they need to fabricate something more, they've got things like these. These are reprints of newspapers that would have been at the time. Also, they're maintaining their historic research library inside that space as well. And then having interactive exhibits like the store inside, and then opportunities to like get out and touch things like the cannons here. If I'm not wrong, these are Napoleonic cannons. And so this like incredible mix between genuine historic artifacts, things that were there and used by soldiers in the 1850s and 60s, and then representational artifacts is stunning to me. One of the things that absolutely blows my mind the most, this is the flag, right? This is the flag that was lowered in August of, I believe, 1868, as they essentially decommissioned this fort. And donated to the museum by Mrs. Samuel Wilkinson. There's such tangible moments there. And it's, for me, conflicting. One of the things I love about the site is that you get to see now that drama between what is the worth of a human life. When you've got the soldiers trying to determine, can we rob someone of their humanity just because they were our enemy in war? Or is there something more important to that? I think you see that play out between Couts and Stevens. Then you see that drama recycled when you look at the establishment of Western State Hospital out there. So when Western State came out and occupied it, they turned it into a hospital for the mentally ill, and they create a whole new facility on site. They did the exact same thing the fort did. They used the original structures and then expand outwards from there. So what used to be, the fort store or the fort guardhouse or barracks or quarters is now turned into housing for doctors. Or in the very early days, they were using the barracks as the ward for patients from this hospital. And they're trying to determine yet again, like what is our obligation to our fellow people? And just because someone's an enemy combatant or has a mental illness, do we deprive them of that humanity? Is this question that seems to play itself out on this eternal loop on the Fort Steilacoom site. And being able to go there and experience it, 10 out of 10. I can't recommend it enough. And even when people aren't there as reenactors, being able to walk through that site and see the layers, see when it was a military fort, see when it was part of the mental hospital, is really amazing. For me, I would like to encourage you guys to look into it. So they have their site, Historic Fort Steilacoom. Obviously, they are active here on the chat. So if you would like to ask them any questions or talk to them about anything, they're very good on social media. And they do a really good job of making the history at that site accessible and easy to interpret, which is something for me beyond the bar of excellence. I think if you have access to history, but you make it so that people can't access it themselves, you're just doing a disservice to everyone. Like I said, personally, I think it needs more representation and support because Fort Steilacoom, as a military post, has a moment of human drama, as a museum, as an adjacent facility to a hospital that has treated people with mental illness, has just determined the fate and outcome of Washington, but from the shadows. It isn't the place where people were establishing the laws. It was the place where people were wrestling with their own morality before enacting it on a larger stage. And the fact that we can go and access it in real time as it once was, that's just great. So if you guys have questions, please let me know. I'm happy to answer them. If not, however, I think that is the best introduction that I can give to this incredible site. And now the impetus is on you guys. Go out there, keep on exploring, make sure that you get out there and see what we have, because it's in striking distance, right? Like Steilacoom is not that far. So thank you, my friends. I'll see you guys very soon. Until next time, just keep on exploring, my friends. Happy to be a part of the story.